Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin, and today's video, Lord willing, we're gonna do trimming and making binding. And I don't know about you, I may have a lot to say, but I'm ready to get this show on the road. So let's do it. Here's where we are. We've done our quilting, and now we've got to figure out what to do with all this excess. So what we're gonna have to do is trim it off, and we also need to square it up. So what we're looking for is a straight edge on all the sides, and then ideally as close to a 90-degree angle on this corner as possible. And the straighter the edge and the more square it is, the better the end result will be. So, and that includes our binding in the corner when we miter the corners. So the closer to 90 degrees and the straighter the edge, the better it's gonna be, and it's gonna make it easier for us. So you remember my practice quilt? So I trimmed it and squared it, and you can see, hopefully, that it's a nice straight edge on every side, and the corners are a perfect square. And then that way when we put our binding on, it will look like this in the end, except just finished off. So that's what we're going for today, is this right here, except bigger. And I have found the very best way to square off a quilt is with a tool that is made for squaring things off, which is called a T-square. And my wonderful husband, who is also the everything, the executive producer, the videographer, the sound tech, the editor, he basically does everything, found these for me. He got them at Lowe's. These two T-squares are for drywall. Sorry, I couldn't think of the name of that. Sheetrock. So it's to square up sheetrock. And they are perfect for squaring up a quilt. So if you are willing to spend about 30 bucks, they're $14 before tax, and you think that you're gonna continue to quilt, and you're willing to watch my video called Squaring Up a Quilt, or whatever we call it, then go do that. It's just the best system because you have a tool that is intended to square up things, and we just use them for quilts. So if you want to do that, do that. But since this is your very first quilt, you may only have a ruler and a mat, and that's okay. I'm going to show you how to use what you have to square up our quilt together. Now, you can do this on your floor, on your dining room table, if you have a big island. I'm doing it on my work table because I think it's the easiest to see. So, but you can do this anywhere. And before you get started, I want to tell you, or want to give you a tip. When your quilt is hanging off the edge of either your work table or if you're using your dining table or whatever, once you get it in position, you may want to weight it down so that it doesn't kind of start to slide right as you're getting ready to do some cutting. So I have diced tomatoes. You can use whatever you have. This is a 1 pound, 12 ounce weight that was in my pantry. I'm going to use that just like that to weight down the quilt. You want to have your mat ready to go and your ruler. And again, there are probably as many ways to do this as there are quilters that do it. And if you had a nice big gigantic square and you could put that square down in the corner, then that may be the preferred method and easy, and lots of people have them. If you're like me and you don't have a big square and you just have a mat and a ruler, this is the way I've found that works the best. Start with one straight side, and then we can work from there. So what I have done, because my mat is not as big as my quilt, and my table is not big enough to hold the entire quilt, I have folded it in half. Not exactly in the middle because there are an odd number of rows, but I folded it in the middle right on a seam line. Now your seam is obviously not necessarily perfect, but it will give you a nice straight, it's kind of like when you fold your fabric to cut it. It gives it as straight a line as you can get. And so I have folded my quilt in half, and I'm putting that fold right here on my mat. Now, it is not perfect, but we're going to use our ruler and our mat to get a straight edge. So I've got this roughly on the 4-inch line. You can see right here that it goes off my mat. I'm going to fold this extra batting and backing back. Did you see how the quilt just moved? That's why I'm going to use the weight once I get it positioned. So I'm going to fold it back just to give myself an additional visual. This is not perfectly straight, as you will see as soon as I cut it, the actual piecing, but it's a good kind of guide. So I'm lining this seam. It's this 1-inch vertical line, and I'm just lining that up. So now that's pretty straight, and I can see we want to flatten our quilt out, kind of like when we did our quilt sandwich, but I don't want to tug or pull, especially once I get it in position, because if you do that, then when you take your weight and your ruler off, it's going to go back to the way that it was. So pressing down and pulling doesn't put you down the road any. It just is going to make it warped later once you wash it. I'm just eyeballing this lined up on that 1-inch line. And now I'm going to get my ruler. I want you to use whatever ruler you have, but if you have multiple rulers, the wider the better, because that gives you more landscape to be sure and verify you're straight. So mine is a 6 by 24. I have used my 3.5 by 24, and I'm going to line this up. So I've got the corner of my ruler, it's lined up roughly with the 4-inch mark, same thing down here. And now here's where it's really important. I want to make sure that this line is square with my mat. And that's what's going to give us that nice straight and square line. So again, it's lined up here on 4, lined up here on 4, and it's straight across here. Let me put my tomatoes down. Unopened. And that looks pretty good to me. Now you may be able to see in the shot, it's pretty lined up on the corner right here of this blue, dark blue piece. This light blue piece and this light blue piece are not to the edge, and this is why we squared up, because if you had just glanced at it, you would say, oh, it's just straight, just cut along the piecing. But the reality is there are these where the quilting, the actual act of quilting, pulls it in and takes it off of true. So I've got my mark, I've got that mark, and I'm going to use my little pinky off my cutting mat, off my ruler to kind of stabilize me. And I'm just going to cut that all the way up to the top. Now, I folded this back. I could have just let that hang off, but that's actually how I made sure I had 2 separate places that I verified that this was straight. So I had here, well, actually 3, here, here, and then across the bottom line. So I hope that makes sense. Now, I'm going to pull my ruler away. Now, I am looking at this, nothing like making decisions on camera. And you can see there's still quite a bit of batting and backing. So I'm actually going to move my tomatoes, and I'm going to scoot the quilt over just a little bit more, because I want that to be, if it were into the blue here and not there, that would be fine. The binding itself will cover a lot, but it won't cover everything. So again, I'm just lining that seam up. I've scooted it over just a little bit to make sure that I'm going straight. And now I'm gonna adjust. Once I get this one, this is the hardest one. The very first one is the hardest cut. Okay, I'm gonna put my tomatoes back down. Thank you, tomatoes. So you can see I've scooted this over. This part doesn't really matter because it's gonna be cut off. And now my first mark is a little bit close. It's actually on the blue, and you can see how it's much, much closer now. So that first one was almost like a trowel. All right, so here we go. I did put a fresh blade on my rotary cutter so that I would get a nice, clean, didn't have to do a second pass. Now I'm saying a little prayer there we go. That's what I wanted on the first cut, but oh well, I got it on the second. So do you see that? That is nice and straight. You can also see, I'm pointing right here, there's a little bit of that batting that you can see. And then we had to go a little bit into our actual piecing here. And that's gonna happen all the way around the whole quilt, where the quilting has pulled it in some places and not pulled it in other places. All right, so I've gotten my quilt folded on the other axis. So if we folded the first on the X, now we're on the Y. And I have lined up, this is the good edge, right? This is the straight. And you can see where it ended was actually a little far off of that corner. But remember, our binding is gonna cover that up, and we can go back and trim if we need to. So I have lined, I'm using my mat, and I'm taking my good edge that I just cut, and I'm lining that up there. And now, tomatoes. Now I'm going to do the same thing. So that's 4 1/4, 4 3/8. And I'm gonna do exactly the same. So this is square on the bottom, and that's at 4 3/8, and this is at 4 3/8. And look, if I cut it there, I'm gonna have the same situation that I had last time, where there's too much batting and binding. So I'm gonna cheat in now and do 4 1/2. So I've got my marker there and there. All right, now we're cooking with gas. So that's lined up. I'm gonna reline that up. Okay, so we are good to go. This bottom where the fold is doesn't matter because that top edge is lined up and straight. So don't worry about the fold. You may have creases that are up in there, but that straight line is the one that we lined up so that we would be nice and square. And you will have this, I guess you see how part of that piecing is sticking out right there. And that's gonna happen. Whereas further on down, there's actually still some batting showing right here. You see that? So let's get that out of the way. So we've cut 2 of our sides, and we have one nice good square corner now. And you're just gonna do that around the edge. So you take whatever your side that's square, that's what you line up on your mat. And then you use your ruler with your mat to do the other 2 sides. And then, so I'm gonna do that off camera, you go do that, and then we'll come back and regroup, okay? So I'm finishing up on my trimming, and this is what we have, which is a nice straight line. and a square corner. And you'll see in some places where the batting has poked out, where it's just a little bit past. And then there's some places where I had to cut a little bit into my piecing. And that's part of the process when you quilt. And that's why we have that extra, so that if it crawls over, you trim it off. Or if it pulls back, you can trim that. So that one place where I have a little bit of batting showing, the binding is just going to cover that up. So this is what we have. Nice squared up little quilt and straight edges. And now we're ready to make our binding. I like binding. And I think I like binding because it does just complete, it's just the finishing thing. I don't know. Hopefully you've come to me at this stage with your binding strips, which we are using 2.5-inch wide strips of fabric. If you're using shirts, they may be all different lengths. That's totally okay. Doesn't even matter. And if you don't have an idea even, the way binding works is we're gonna start with a 2.5-inch strip of fabric that we're gonna attach to each other. And then it will get folded in half when it's time to attach it, and then get sewn down the edge of the front, and then we're gonna fold around the back. So that's kind of the way that's gonna go. I would encourage you to get thread that's just as close to the color of your binding as possible. Because if you are like me and you kind of tend to, whatever thread is in your machine, you roll with it. And then if you're also like me and you get a little aggressive with your ironing and your thread that you made your binding with does not match your binding, then sometimes you can see it in the final quilt. I feel like the sample baby quilt, remember our sample baby quilt? I feel like it was this is the what not to do quilt. So if you can see right there, that dark binding, ooh, and when I tip it and the light catches it, you can just see those white stitches. Do you see them right there where my purple thing is pointing? And is it egregious? Not really. Could it be better if I had just taken the time to put some charcoal gray thread, which I have, by the way? Whatever you have chosen for your binding, totally fine. I would just try to get as close as possible with your thread color. I have this kind of light gray, it's almost silver actually, binding. And I did a test run with it because, I don't want to do a bad job on camera. And I just did it with white thread, thinking that I would come back and put my pale gray thread. And there is so much of a sheen on this fabric that I couldn't even see where I had put the stitches. So I just am going to be working with white thread. What we're going to do is we're going to attach our binding together. It is just a little nicer to have it on the angle, which I want to say on the bias, but I'm not sure that's right. I think it's just on the diagonal, which I said really funny, diagonal, diagon alley, diagonally. What did he just say? Diagonally. So what I'm doing is I have trimmed my binding strips to where they're straight across, or as straight across as I can make them. In my particular fabric, I don't have right sides with this fabric. So, but if you happen to have, if you're using a fabric that there's a pattern on it that's only on one side, you want to put right sides together at this point. We're going to do it on the diagonal so that as the binding goes around the quilt, it will start over here and end up over there, if that makes any sense. Okay, so I'm lining this up. Now, pins are going to be your friend. We don't have to use a lot of them, but we do need to pin. And the reason is, some people find binding really fiddly. And I have found that to be true until I figured out a pin arrangement that took the fiddle out of the fiddly. We're gonna line these up together, and you can see that's straight across there, straight across here. And if you can imagine, there's an imaginary line of where that fabric is underneath. So I have actually drawn it on my, on my fabric, but it's imaginary. Where that ends, so you see that square? Where it gets kind of wiggly is where this leg is loose and where this leg is loose, and kind of where they come together. So even just that movement took it off of the edge of that. So I'm gonna line these up back again with my imaginary line, and I'm gonna take my first pin and pin it right here, just above that line, and kind of, doesn't have to necessarily go into where that leg is, but I kind of like it. It seems like it makes it feel a little more sturdy. And then essentially same thing, but at the top. And I don't want to get into the place where that point is, because we're gonna sew this line right here. So I'm gonna do it over here. Actually, I'm gonna pick this up so I can make sure it's straight. So hopefully you can see that. I'm just gonna put a pin right here kind of loosely in the middle so that that will stay straight. And then you would think you would put it over here, but this is gonna be under the presser foot. And this is the part that always seemed to pull for me. So I started off putting pins in the middle and they got in the way, and this is my solution and it works for me. So hopefully you'll enjoy it as well. So I've got my pins stabilizing the two sides. And now what we've got to do is figure out how to make a nice seam right here on this line. Now, you can absolutely get a little ruler and take your ruler and draw your line and seam straight on your line. You can 100% do that. But what I found is once I put my pins down, then my pins are kind of in the way of my ruler. But if I try to put my ruler down before I put my pins in, then my strips wiggled and got fiddly more than normal. And what I have discovered is you really don't have to have a line. You just need a couple of dots. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put a dot right here in this corner. And I'm just using a graphite pencil. You can use a chalk pencil. I wouldn't use a permanent marker, but you can use kind of whatever you have that will wash out. You can see, I'm just imagining where that corner goes. You see that? Right where that corner ends. And so I'm kind of doing a little bit of guesswork, but honestly, it's not really, doesn't have to be guesswork. I can just lift it up and look. And then a little dot right here in this corner. Because what I want is I want my seam to go from this corner to this corner as closely as possible. And does not have to be perfect, P.S. And I'll show you why it does not have to be perfect. So once I've got my dots together, now I'm gonna lift up my presser foot. Now it is totally personal preference. I like to orient my fabric this way so that this leg is going through the middle and over, and this one is back and to my right. And what I'm gonna do, my needle is actually down in the down position, and I'm gonna leave it there. And I'm just going to butt that little dot right up to my needle, and I am just gonna connect the dot. So let's do it. And away we go. So what I'm just doing is I'm imagining just a line connecting those dots. I'm gonna go a little bit past and use my snips. And I'm gonna hold this back here where you can see it. And because that thread, because of the sheen on my fabric, and because I'm using that white thread, you really can barely see it. But I'm gonna hopefully tip it back where you can see the seam. And it went through that dot and it went through this dot. And now let's check our work. Did y'all's teacher ever say that? Your math teacher? Check your work. I'm like, well, if I did it wrong, then I'm not gonna know that it's wrong. Yeah, I did that. So, but here's how you check your work with binding. You fold that top back and you finger press a little bit. Do you remember the scoffing over the finger? The finger pressing is a real thing. And look at that beauty. Okay, so do you see how when we press that, even just with my finger pressing, and this fabric has a herringbone pattern. Actually, it's woven in herringbone, so it's kind of stretchy. But you can see that once I get that press, that's going to be really nice. So it's just kind of a straight line here. Let me get my purple thing again. So it's straight here. It's pretty straight there. I had a little bit of an extra right there, but not anything substantial. And so then you do that for all of the strips. So it's really like, that's it. All right, so I'm doing my dots. Again, this time you might be able to see. Let me see if I can really get down on it and make a good mark. All right, you see that? I'm gonna butt that little dot right up to my needle. Get that thrown over there so it's just not pulling against me. Imagine a straight line to my dot. Connect the dots. And here's the great thing about if you do go a little askew, like I felt like I did, and I think I did. You may be able to see. Just I had a little there and a little there, but just a little bit. Because of the way binding works, that seam is not going to be, you're not going to be able to tell because it's going to be folded and then folded again. So here's the first fold, and that's, gets sewn down, and then it gets folded again over the back. So there's no place where that seam is lined up with itself and you would ever know that it's anything but straight. I happened to nail it on both of these, which is super rewarding because it shows that it works. I have done this and thought I had it lined up right, and it's not lined up right. And you can, like, even in finger pressing, like, ooh, kind of miss that one a little bit. And the great thing about that, the whole time you're making binding, you can remind yourself, if you start feeling intimidated, that there is no raw edge that's going to be exposed. So if this is not lined up right, or if this one is not lined up right, it's going to get folded and then folded over the fold. So you're never going to see that. And you can really, especially because we're going to hand stitch on the back, if you have some of those wavery places, is that a word? Wavery? Wavery? Anyway, you can adjust when we do the hand stitching, and also when you do the machine stitching, which thankfully we're not doing today. We want to get rid of the bulk of this because none of that needs to be in the seam or in the binding. You can put this on your cutting mat and use your rotary cutter and then just cut at the 1/4 inch, like you're making a 1/4 inch seam allowance, because guess what? That's what you're doing. Or you can use your scissors, and I happen to have these big ones that I break shirts down with, and you can just kind of eyeball it. Now I'm wondering how close I got by eyeballing it. That is so very like me. Let's just see. Oh, look at that. Ha ha. Oh, I'm getting better. I'm terrible at spatial relations, so it's really remarkable that I got close at all. So here's my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and there's woohoo, look at me go. So you can just cut it. Don't throw these away, these little triangles, even though you might be inclined to. There are probably hundreds of quilt patterns that use these little triangles, and you can do scrap quilts with them. I have not done one of those yet, but I hear it's a thing, and I've seen them. So you can use your scissors. I'm going to do this one too. Or you can, again, it really is easier. Like, I usually have my cutting mat right here, and I just have my rotary cutter next to me, and you can just do it with either one. And so there we go. So I'm just gonna, that one was a little bit probably bigger. And then You can actually press your seam either way. I tend to press open, which is probably actually one of those, that white thread showed in the dark charcoal binding. But you can do your little finger press. You can do your finger press on this side. And you can see, look at that, look at that. And you do the whole thing that way. And that's really it. So if you felt like, making binding, it's really not hard. It's meticulous, which boy, isn't that like all of quilting. But that's also what's great, because it's like you get to pay attention to those details and then you get rewarded in the end with something really beautiful. So you just do the little thing. You do not actually have to ever press this if you don't want to. I do. That's, if you've watched the other videos, that's probably unsurprising to you that I do press them. And there is a school of thought or whatever theory about binding that you should go in and press this in half, because it is going to be sewn down in half. I don't actually press mine in half. And the reason I don't is because when we put it on our quilt, it's going to get sewn down like this and then folded back over. And so the outside of the fabric actually has to travel further than the inside that's right up against the quilt seam. So if you press it and then sew it down, when you fold it over, it's actually really hard to keep your fold nice on the back. And it's kind of forcing the fabric, the outside of the fabric, to work harder than it has to. And then there might actually be a little bit more bunchy up on the inside. So I don't press mine in half, but you can. It's totally fine if you want to. So, huzzah. That's really it. So, and of course, I've had a lot to say about it, which maybe we'll edit a lot of it out, but probably not. So that's that. What you will need for the next video, or for your next step, actually, not the next video, your next step in your quilt, is you'll need your binding. And if you have not actually already done the math, you need enough binding stitched together to cover the entire perimeter of your quilt, plus at least 10 inches for where we're going to match it up and for corners. For our quilt that we're making here together, that comes out to be 184 inches in total length. So as long as you have that much, you're good. You need your matching thread. So like for mine, when I do the hand stitching on the back, I will get a thread that nearly exactly matches it. So there's that. I don't know if you can see that. It's pretty darn close. Actually, isn't that beautiful? Both of them shiny and pretty. And you will need just a regular old needle. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. You probably just have a sewing needle laying around. My sister made me this needle keeper, and this is wool felt. And I just have my needles and some random pins, and then like embroidery needles for, that's not called embroidery needles. There are embroidery needles in here, but can't think of what that's called. It'll come to me later. When you get to the end of knitting or crocheting and you need to weave in your yarn needle? I don't know. So I just have, it's just a regular old needle. I'm sure there's probably super important needles that you're supposed to use for this. I use whatever needle I have. So that is that. I hope you've enjoyed being with me today. I have enjoyed this whole series, and I hope you're having fun making your quilt, and I hope the trimming and making the binding process seems a little less daunting. I'm Kathy Martin, and this is the Catbird Quilts. Thank you so much for watching.